Andrea Waddell here. Welcome to the studio. Today I'm going to talk to you about 5 big mistakes to avoid when you're working with oil and cold wax. This painting started here and ended up here, and there were some mistakes that were made along the way that I wanted to talk to you about, and I think it'll be helpful. So this was a first underlayer, and this is all about drying times, some of these mistakes, and scraping back to what I can get to was fine. I thought this was going to be a landscape. It turned out not to be a landscape. So this part is fine. I let this set up overnight and I'm scratching back and getting some luminosity. Now I have so many colors. I'm going to try to unify this with, which is a good practice, by the way, with one color over all of those colors, just to get something that's just a little bit, more unified, less color, and that's dry pigment. Swooshing back, trying to get to some underlayers. And here is mistake number 1. Is not starting with anything transparent, instead using graphite lines, and that starts to just become mud when you scratch back into it or use solvent reduction to get to the back there. It's just pretty muddy. They were water-soluble graphite pencils, and I don't like to start this way, and I was demonstrating how not to start things in a workshop I was teaching, and then I wound up trying to resolve this and realized it really isn't a great way to start. So now I'm adding color. I'm trying to harmonize this. I'm convinced it's going to be a landscape, but it's not wanting to be a landscape. I'm trying all kinds of things, adding patterns, adding things, which leads me to mistake number 2 is not stepping back to see the things at a distance. So you don't know what you're doing. You can't see the composition if you don't step back. Mistake number 3 is working when you're tired. And in this case, I've created this kind of creepy color that got me into trouble. I did harmonize it with this light blue. And if I had stepped back from this, I would have seen right here that the color harmony was there. But I was right on top of things, really pushing, and didn't see that. And I added this blue, and that kind of wrecked the harmony. If I'd stopped here, this would have been a perfect place to just stop and let it set up. But anyway, I kept going, added something bright. Now I have 2 bright areas, one at the top, one at the bottom. It's gotten messy. I'm pulling at it, getting a little confused. You can't really see this, but you can see those lines at the back when I did some solvent reduction. So rather than being transparent and lovely, it's just kind of this gray, unpleasant color. So I'm finding luminosity by adding pigment. But the mistake is working wet on wet and trying to go too far with your layers and not letting them set up overnight and working on multiple things at the same time so you don't obsess over the painting, which is probably a really big part of this. So instead of that, I added light layers, and it was just overworked, wet on wet, wet on wet, wet on wet.
Okay.
And it's actually kind of stressful if you do this. And if you let that set up, you could scratch back and you can play with the underlayers. But if you don't do it and you just keep adding wet on wet, you can't really do anything except to keep on adding. So I'm building contrasts, lights over darks, wet on wet. That's another mistake really to avoid. And eventually I wrangled it into a composition by adding, a lot of the dark and then bringing back in that gorgeous pigment. And I got to a composition that I like that's in thirds, and there was luminosity from adding layers but not subtracting any, which is kind of the issue. And then I had fun. I let it set up for 3 days, and then I could just build in some transfers and start to fix that composition in thirds and do something with that upper third through transfer techniques that are really fun, fixing the lines, working it out, more relaxed, using wax paper here. And then eventually it became this painting, which was essentially mostly about adding layers. But I did like where it got to, but some mistakes along the way.